The stale smell in the waiting room did nothing to quell the queasiness in my stomach. I looked around and then back at my feet, wondering what I was really doing here. To my left sat my beautiful wife, Rachel. She was, as always, radiant with a beauty that never failed to make my butterflies flutter. To my right sat my daughter, Jasmine, who in many ways was my savior. My thoughts went back to the day I met each of them. I was a different person then. "Mr. Green," a voice called out, bringing me back into the room. "We'll be ready to receive you in about 20 minutes. The other witness has just come forward." I nodded. For the first time in over a year, I would be coming face to face with my ex-wife. The woman I had been married to for 12 years of my life, but so much had changed since then. I'll start with the day my life changed forever. It was an ordinary spring day in Albany, New York. I was coming home from working with customers at the local Albany utility company. I hated the job, and Jessica, my ex-wife, pretty much forced me to do it. "It's safer and financially rewarding," she said. Usually the next comment was, "It's better than construction." I should have guessed earlier that all she seemed to care about was money and social status. I don't want to say too much about Jessica, except that in her 35 years, she was still the most beautiful girl in the world to me. She was smart, funny, and loved me to death from the moment we met. I always thought she was beyond me. I was working construction at my home in the Bronx when we met. I was tall and quite good-looking, with a permanent tan from being outdoors all the time. From the moment we started dating, we were always together. I was her protector, and she disregarded my lack of academic background and seemed to love me even more passionately. When she earned her master's degree, we moved back to her hometown of Albany and eventually married. Her parents were not at all enamored with me, oh no, and didn't even try to hide their dislike. Both they and her old friends thought she was too good for me and wondered why she married a man beneath her in rank. According to her father, I was a handsome dullard. Nevertheless, we were happy and loved each other more than anything else in the world. I was the only child in the family, and both my parents died when I was a teenager, so Jessica became my whole world. I found work in construction, and Jessica got a very good job in a finance company owned by a friend of her father's. When the recession hit in 1908, I lost my job, and it was only Jessica's paycheck that got us through the hard times. This caused her parents to hate me even more, if that was possible. It really affected our marriage. I think that's how it should be when the people you love and socialize with tell you that your husband is a loser. Unfortunately, it has also affected my friends back home in the Bronx. Now, according to them, I rotated in other circles. Of course, my best friend Joey was always there for me. He was more like a brother to me, and his parents helped me through the loss of my own parents. Jessica was the one who convinced me to get a job at the utility company. Like I said, I hated it. Indoors, behind computers, talking to people on the phone in a fake voice, I envisioned hell. But I was trying for Jessica and for us. We both hoped to have children someday. But it was more important for Jessica to have a successful career and be seen to have children. Image, wealth, and status didn't really bother me, but I did everything Jessica wanted me to do, and even tried to be everything Jessica wanted me to be. Unfortunately, when you stop being yourself, things go wrong and you end up being an unhappy person. I was no longer the cheerful construction worker from the Bronx who loved to have fun and be around people. I became depressed almost every day, gained weight, stopped grooming myself, and rarely socialized, if at all. Yes, I was an overweight office worker married to a successful financial analyst who attended fancy dinners and cocktail parties with Albany's elite. I wasn't one of them. They knew, and I knew it. I pulled into the driveway of our house and was surprised to see Jessica's car in the garage. I got out of the car and headed toward the house with a sense of impending dread. I didn't know why, but when I entered the kitchen, Jessica was sitting at the table with a serious but confident look. She had some papers in front of her, and when I was about to speak, she interrupted me. "Mikey, we need to talk." Those famous words came down on me like a ton of bricks. I could see she was a little nervous, but there were no tears on her face when I sat down. "What's wrong, baby?" I asked. "Is everything okay?" She pulled herself together, cleared her throat like she was preparing for a big speech. "I'm sorry, Michael, but I want a divorce," she said clearly and calmly. My heart dropped and my stomach clenched into a lump. I was at a loss for words when I felt someone run a hand down my chest and grab my heart. That horrible feeling of sudden loss that I had experienced twice before was the worst feeling you can imagine. It spreads through your body like a virus. I looked at her, and with a tremor in my voice, I squeezed out, "Why?" I stuttered. "I fell in love with someone else," she said, looking at me without a shadow of pity. I was shocked, but strangely, I didn't feel shocked. The old Mikey Green would have caused chaos, but he no longer existed. Jessica had taken care of that. I was just a shell of the man I used to be, and here she was, finishing me off with one last sword stroke. "How long?" I said hoarsely. 4 months. When I just stared at her, she said, "But now I want us to be together and get married," she said without thinking about my feelings. I was looking at a woman I no longer recognized, and in the reflection, she was looking at a man she no longer recognized. "I don't want to know the details, but I want to know why," I said finally, dreading what her answer might be. She, wasting no time, replied, "Look at you, Mikey. You're not the man I married. You're overweight. You've been unshaven for years. And when was the last time you got a decent haircut or bought new clothes?" She said in what must have been a burst of long-contained emotion, "You're just a shell of the man I fell in love with. And let's be honest, you've never been on my intellectual level, have you?" she said mockingly. "God knows how many times I've had to defend you to my parents, friends, and co-workers over the past 10 years, explaining to them why we got married in the first place." She continued, "And I suddenly wondered where the girl I'd fallen in love with had disappeared to, and who this heartless creature sitting in front of me was. And rich. I mean, my new man is younger than you, fit, attractive, has a successful business and a big house near Mom and Dad in Loudonville." Each new word she spoke was like a dagger piercing my body. "Do I know him?" I asked timidly. "He runs a gardening company that operates in the neighborhood. At the moment he's self-employed, but we want to expand the business together," she added as I continued to remain silent. Finally, she finished and just sat there, waiting for the next question, no doubt to aggravate me even more. When I remained silent, she slid the papers toward me. "Dad and his lawyer helped me draw up the divorce papers. I think it's a good deal for you. Considering I've paid off most of the mortgage, Dad recommended a 70/30th split of the house in my favor, which we can sell since I'm going to move in with Rich. I just looked at her and she continued, "I think a 50/50th split of our savings would be fair, and I won't be asking for alimony, although I'm sure I could fight for something if I wanted to." Now I could clearly hear the arrogance and anger in her voice. How could I have overlooked it all these years? I felt like a fool, and she probably thought I'd always been that way. "Let's be honest, Mikey. I make a lot more money than you do, and my new boyfriend makes a lot too, so I won't touch your retirement fund if you sign the papers and don't argue with me about anything." She suddenly stopped talking when I looked her straight in the eye. She must have seen a glimpse of the old Mikey because she swallowed hard. I grabbed a pen and signed my name for 12 years together. I got up from the table, went to our bedroom, gathered my things, and came back. She was sitting at the table looking through papers when I walked past her out the door and disappeared from her life. "What did she say?" shouted Joey. "She's LOL?" To me, Joey is my family, and unfortunately I have neglected him over the past few years. But as true brothers, we are able to overcome any wrongdoings and will always be there for each other in times of need. While we were discussing what happened, I heard someone in the background and Joey trying to silence them. "Is that Helen?" I asked. "What's she saying?" "Yes, Mikey. She said good riddance to that stuck-up bitch." Joey and Helen had what is called a no-filter attitude. What you see is what you get, and God, I miss that. That's how I used to be. "Hey, Mikey. I have a friend of Helen's who does debtor investigations for local companies. I could have him run a background check on this guy for you. You know, see if the asshole is legit and all that?" he asked in his usual boorish manner. "I don't really care, buddy," I said dejectedly. "This guy is setting you up, stealing your wife, and you just sit back and take it." "Fuck, Mikey. She really turned you into a wuss," he said, raising his voice. Damn, that hurt, and Joey must have realized it too. I'm sorry, bro. I'm mad as hell, and I wish you were too, he said in an apologetic tone. It's okay, Joey. I mean, you're right and all. Do what you want, I said. I told him the few details I had about this new guy. He was the gardener next door, so it wasn't that hard to get more information if Helen's acquaintance wanted it. You need to get back in the game, Mikey, and be yourself again, he instructed before we eventually hung up. After hanging up, I leaned back on the cheap motel bed and stared at the fan whirring under the ceiling. I was dizzy and trying to make sense of everything that had happened in my life, not just in the last few hours, but in the last 12 years. Sleep wasn't coming to me, so I grabbed the bottle of Jack Daniels that was on the table and drank straight from the neck. Over the next few weeks, I did the same thing. Often I would show up sick to work or come in drunk and smell of booze, causing me to be sent home. Everyone in the office looked up to me. Snide comments were shared behind my back, and I felt like I was watching myself from above, just participating in life. I was recommended to see a doctor, and while that helped, quitting my job gave me more time to reflect on the past. I never made it to the Jones and Brown office to finalize the divorce. A letter was sent to my office because no one knew where I was and no one was going to bother looking. I knew that for sure. The letter contained a divorce agreement and a check for $175,000. That was my share of the house, savings, and household assets. The agreement stated everything Jessica had said at the kitchen table, and since I wasn't present at the meeting, it was executed in absentia. I had no idea if it was all legal and fair, but I had no energy left to resist. In any case, it wasn't enough for Jessica and her powerful entourage. It had been a month since Jessica had told me she wanted a divorce, and I finally transferred the check to my account. I discovered that all of our other accounts had been closed, and Jessica had removed her name from our joint account. However, I was aimlessly wandering out of the bank when I heard a voice calling my name. I didn't pay attention at first, but when I finally turned around, I saw Pete and Shelley, my old neighbors. Hi, Michael, Pete said as he approached me. Sorry to hear about the divorce, he said nervously. Now his wife Shelley, she was a nosy neighbor and loved to gossip, and it didn't take her long to calm down. I can't believe Jessica left you and remarried. I looked at her in surprise. I seemed to remember Jessica saying that she wanted to marry this guy, but I was in such a state of mind at the time that I forgot about it. Oh, you didn't know? Shelley continued. I had no idea, I said with an indifferent look on my face. We thought you guys were a real family, said Peter. Then we see she's married to Richard Walton. That's when I first heard his full name. But when I looked at Shelley, she seemed to recoil and cringe at the mere mention of his name. I ignored it, as I suddenly thought that I now had a last name to give to Joey's friend, not the gardener Rich from Albany. He was the gardener who serviced your neighborhood, I said, providing information I hadn't been asked for. At that moment, I saw Peter turn around sharply and look at Shelley, who by now was turning bright red. Our garden, he said, yelling at Shelley and attracting stares from passers-by. Why did you pick the red shells? He asked when I realized I had hit the sweet spot. No, Peter, no, never, Shelley pleaded. He tried it on me once, and I put him in his place. Peter was already blushing himself and looking rather angry as Shelley continued. He's a scumbag, and every time he comes over, I go away for hours to avoid seeing him. I never told you because I knew you'd get mad, she said as she took his hand and pleaded with him. We need to talk, he said before turning to me and apologizing. He grabbed her hand and led her down the sidewalk. I guess this is another lost client for Jessica and Richard's growing empire, I thought to myself. And for the first time in a long time, I managed to smile. The news of the wedding had hit me hard. I got depressed again and reached for the bottle again. I thought it would be a good idea to try to drink myself to death. Then all the pain would go away, and I wouldn't have to continue my meaningless existence. The next morning, I got up from my motel bed and collapsed on the floor, drenched in vomit. I had officially hit rock bottom. I crawled into the shower on all fours and let the cold water pour over me. As I stepped out of the bathroom, I looked in the mirror and what I saw in it shocked me. "Fuck you!" I shouted to the man who was staring back at me. "I need to get better." I fell to my knees and cried for the first time since my mom died. "I just want to be happy," I screamed, covering my face with my hands. I knew something had to change. The following Monday, I walked into my office and got to work. For some reason, my personal email ended up on my desk. I assumed it had been diverted there because no one knew where I lived. Browsing through mostly unnecessary junk, I came across a flyer for a local gym promising to get anyone in shape in 12 weeks. I snorted to myself, thinking it would take longer than that. But heck, I thought, maybe that's exactly what I needed. That night, when I walked into the gym, I had no idea what the young, beautiful instructor standing in front of me might have thought of this old man. In my 38 years, I felt like an 80-year-old man, but as I stepped closer to her, she extended her graceful hand to me, which I gladly accepted. "I'm Jasmine," she introduced herself. To say she thought I was worthless would be an understatement, but in her beautiful brown eyes, I saw a semblance of hope for me. They seemed to give me energy, not lust or anything romantic, but honesty and compassion. So over the next week, I managed to move out of the motel and sign a lease on a small studio apartment in town, not far from the gym. I decided to focus on my 12-week plan and see where life would take me. I needed to lose about 15 pounds, and the best place to start was to get rid of all the unopened bottles of alcohol among my belongings. Over the next month, I worked very hard. There was nothing else in my life but work and the gym. Joey and Helen also managed to visit me a few times, no doubt primarily to check up on me. But by the end of the month, and thanks to Jasmine's continued support, I had already lost 5 pounds. Thanks to spending almost every day at the gym, I got to know Jasmine much better. One evening after my class, she agreed to have coffee with me, and I learned a little about her life. She was raised by a single mom and was attending a local college to become a full-time fitness trainer and nutritionist. She certainly knew her stuff, and I developed an even greater sympathy for her. I told her about my recent divorce and my former life in the Bronx. I admitted to her that I had hit rock bottom before I joined the gym and met her. I tried my best not to sound like a desperate scumbag, but she was beyond her years in terms of compassion and emotional maturity. It wasn't until a few sessions later when I stepped out of the shower and met her that I was stunned. Jasmine was talking to a woman who at first glance looked like her sister. I know it sounds corny, but it's true. Jasmine noticed me looking at her and walked over to me before I could turn and walk away. "Michael, this is my mom, Rachel," she said, smiling as Rachel held out her hand to me. Our gazes met, and I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. My stomach twisted, and I was truly at a loss for words. The silence was getting awkward. "That means he likes you, Mom," Jasmine said with a laugh, saving me from that. "He's quiet when he likes someone," she added, as if she'd known me all her life. The truth is, I wasn't always a quiet, shy, and unassuming person. Years of what I now consider emotional abuse will do that to you. Jasmine left to gather her things, and Rachel and I got to talking. When Jasmine returned, she invited me across the street for dinner. I was hesitant at first, but her persistence made it hard to say no. I imagined that if she had a father, she would have circled him. At dinner, Rachel was so cordial and sweet. I immediately realized that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and as the evening progressed, I relaxed in their company. There was no need to put on a show or act pretentious with them. They weren't people who thought they were better than anyone else. Rachel made a lot of jokes, and that put me at ease. We briefly touched on our past, and I guessed that Jasmine had told her mother about my life. I left that night feeling better than I had in months or even years. I even had Rachel's number written down in my phone after she agreed, or should I say insisted, to finally sort out the mess in my head. I resisted at first, but since Rachel was a hairdresser, I gave in. This elicited the sweetest laugh I've ever heard from a woman. For the next couple months, Rachel and I were inseparable. When we finally made love, the passion was intense and full of love, and it felt perfect every time. From then on, all I could think about was her. And finally, my heart ached for another woman. I knew we shouldn't rush into it because I didn't want her to think she was some sort of backlash against Jessica. We wanted to make sure our feelings for each other were real. We had both been treated unfairly in life, so trust was very important to both of us. Eventually, I took her back to my hometown where Joey and Helen immediately fell in love with her. One evening, Helen took me aside in the kitchen and said, "This is the woman for you, Mikey. Don't let her go." I assured her there was no chance of that. "Really, I don't believe you. 0.80 kilograms. Really?" I said excitedly. "Yes, exactly 80, Jasmine confirmed. "You're back to your ideal weight." "Daddy," she said, laughing at her new name for me. I was so proud of myself and so grateful to Jasmine and Rachel for helping me achieve this. My new haircut, as well as giving up my beard, must have contributed to some of the weight loss, I thought. One day, Rachel convinced me to get a clean shave so she could see my face. I laughed at the suggestion. I just hoped she wouldn't be put off by the man. Fortunately, that wasn't the case. So I was over the moon. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I'd achieved what I'd set out to do. I looked great and felt great. That was the attitude I had when I worked on a construction site in New York. I headed towards Rachel's house feeling over the moon. When I walked through the door, I was greeted by a worried and pale Rachel. The look of worry on her face gave me a sense of déjà vu. "What's wrong, baby?" I asked nervously, and I got that bad feeling again. "We need to talk," she said. Suddenly, I felt the walls shrinking around me. The familiar sensation returned, and nausea came up to my throat. "Okay," I said, as Rachel took my hand and sat me down. "Look, Rachel, if you're going to break up with me, just make it quick so I can get out of here," I said sharply as she recoiled in shock. "No, honey," she replied, squeezing my hand tighter and pulling me slightly to her. "I don't know how to say this because I don't want you to be mad at me." My feeling of dread didn't go away. "I'm pregnant," she announced hesitantly. I was shocked. We were silent for a few seconds, and her beautiful face crinkled as she tried to gauge my reaction. I rose to my feet and stepped back a few steps. I turned back to her, looking worried and ready to cry. I screamed at the top of my lungs, simultaneously bouncing in the air with my fists raised. Her face brightened up and joy appeared in her eyes again. "You're not mad?" she asked, regaining her beautiful smile. "How could I be mad? I'm going to be a daddy," I announced, before wrapping my arms around her and kissing her passionately on the lips. For the next 5 minutes, we hugged each other. I was the happiest man on earth. Over the next few days, Rachel, Jasmine, and I started looking for a place to live. While Rachel had very little in savings, I had about $180,000 in my bank account, which was more than enough to buy a house right away. It took less than a week to find a beautiful 5-bedroom colonial-style house in Pine Hills. It was in need of renovation, which deterred other buyers, but given my construction experience, I was excited about its potential. Our offer was accepted, which meant we didn't need to take out a mortgage. The day we moved into our new home, I got down on one knee and proposed to Rachel. I knew it was quick, but I loved her so much, and she was my one and only. She said yes, and I wish I could say we've lived happily ever after since, but that wouldn't touch the reason I'm sitting here in this courthouse. Just to be clear, I'm not being charged with anything. So a couple weeks after moving into our new house, I got a call from Joey. It was, to say the least, an amazing experience. I had completely forgotten that Joey had asked Helen's co-worker to look into my ex-wife's new husband, and frankly, Joey had done the same. If it had gone on for months, I had no idea what it would have cost me, and frankly, I didn't even want to know what he'd found out. Nevertheless, Joey was beyond excited and just had to tell me about his findings. I was silent as Joey began to speak. "It all looks like a house of cards, Mikey," he said, laughing. "Helen's acquaintance did some digging, and after you gave us your full name, that set things in motion. Turns out the IRS and the feds were knocked off their feet." "Wait, what?" I shouted, thinking I had missed most of the story. "What do you mean the feds got knocked down?" "Just listen to this, Mikey. Just listen to this," he said, trying to calm me down. "Jessica is listed as a director of a gardening company he owns, and she's in debt, Mikey. I mean serious debt, and that's just the beginning. The house he owned is now registered in Jessica's name and is worth over $1 million. But the mortgage payments are made through a company called Richwall Enterprises. That company owns the house and the business. Jessica and Richard are listed as joint co-owners, and it only started 6 months ago, probably right after they got married. I struggled to keep up and knew Joey was doing his best to pass on what Helen had apparently told him. Helen's acquaintance had alerted the IRS, who, by the way, would pay his bill. I was glad to hear that I wasn't going to be put on hold for a huge bill. Anyway, the IRS investigated Richard Walton and found out that he was on their wanted list. They had a picture of him. "So he's a crook?" I said, stating the obvious. "Oh yes, Mikey, but wait till you hear what happened next," he said, teasing me. "Well, this investigation has gotten the attention of some big corporation in Charlotte." "North Carolina?" I put in. "Yes," Joey said excitedly. "The owner of the corporation's name is Davis Nolan, and he has a daughter, Julia Reed. She is currently living separately from her husband, Kyle Reed. They have 2 children together, and..." By this point, I was seriously confused. "Go on, Joey," I said irritably. "Listen carefully, kid," he said, panting. "Well, it turns out that Kyle Reed is Richard Walton." "What?" I shouted into the tube, and Joey's ears must have been ringing. Not that he cared. He was too busy bursting out laughing. "Yeah, and they're still legally married. I think they call him a bigamist, but that's not the most important thing," he said, leaving me to wait for him to continue. This was starting to resemble a Hollywood movie. "Well, the FBI got involved, and it turned out that this guy had 2 prior convictions. He was in prison, I think, for drugs and burglary. Mr. Nolan managed to get a reduced sentence on the second one. Apparently, he's a powerful man. Anyway, the feds investigated, and this guy, Kyle Richard, made contact with another suspect they were looking for in connection with drug trafficking offenses." My thoughts went back to Jessica, her friends and family. I just pictured their faces when they heard the news. I started to smile. "There's more, Mikey. The FBI and the IRS joined forces and apprehended this guy. They found him in a warehouse near his home, and the answer to the question of how a man mired in debt could afford $1 million house and live a lavish lifestyle became crystal clear." "How, Joey? How?" "I'm hooked. They found heroin, ecstasy, and stolen goods in his apartment and truck. They really think he was going to run again. There were suitcases of clothes and other things in his truck." I started laughing, and Rachel joined me on the couch, shaking her head and laughing too. She had no idea what she was laughing at or what made me so happy. "So what about Jessica?" I asked, and Rachel abruptly turned around and looked at me. I covered the phone with my hand and whispered to her. "You're not going to believe this," I said with a shake of my head and left her hanging. Joey kept talking as I brought the tube to my ear. "She had been arrested. Her parents have somehow managed to keep it from the press, but I expect it to be front-page news in the next few days. After all, it's big news," he said. In fact, I think Joey was more excited than I was because, honestly, any feelings I had for Jessica, whether it was the illness or anything else, were gone. I took Rachel's hand and squeezed it, just to confirm that fact. Finished talking, I eagerly turned to Rachel and told her everything. She was shocked and surprised because even though she knew Jessica was a complete bitch, it never occurred to her that she could be a criminal. All I could think about was what her parents, family, and the so-called social elite thought of her. Poor old Daddy had a daughter who was a deluded criminal, and that couldn't hurt at the country club. I laughed involuntarily to myself, and Rachel realized what I was thinking and laughed with me. A few days later, the story was front-page coverage in all the local papers and on all the news channels. I guess Jessica's parents still had some clout in the community because she was barely mentioned. Sure, the bigamist and drug-dealing con artist was written about all over the pages, but the name of a female accomplice who revolved in the elite circles of society and was well known in the corporate financial world was not mentioned. Not a week later, however, one newspaper published a photo of both of them with prisoner numbers, but no mention of Jessica's name. We found out that Kyle Reed was actually 41 years old, not 35 as he claimed. So my ex-wife had actually left me for an elderly criminal who had just ruined her life. Perhaps she wasn't as smart as she thought she was. I was just shocked to see my ex-wife. I had to look back several times to recognize her. She looked like a shadow of the confident and arrogant woman who had left me almost 8 months ago. She was haggard and looked like she had aged. Her hair had thinned and there were huge dark bags under her eyes. I looked up and saw my beautiful pregnant bride who looked the complete opposite of her. I felt like the luckiest man in the world, not only to have her, but to be rid of my ex and her family. In the months that followed, all the problems subsided. We enjoyed our first family Christmas in our new home. Rachel's parents came to visit us. Helen and Joey stopped by for a visit, and I was surprised to see several of my old friends I had worked with on the construction site get back in touch. They had fallen in love with Rachel, too, and they were the ones who persuaded me to get back into construction work. Rachel and Jasmine agreed with them, which is another reason I love them. In the new year, I quit my job and became a self-employed entrepreneur. I worked on construction sites, but I also did a little work around the neighborhood. Ironically, I also started getting a lot of requests to work in the garden in many neighborhoods. I was even surprised when Peter and Shelley contacted me, but only if I promised not to try anything on Shelley. I gave them my word. In March, Rachel gave birth to our twins, Alex and Sophia. In April, we were married in a small ceremony in Albany. It had been a little over a year since my divorce from Jessica, and to think how much had happened in that time was just amazing. Sadly, however, that wasn't the last time I saw her. My new perfect life was going so well until quite unexpectedly a visitor knocked on my door. His name was Andrew Brown from the law firm of Jones and Brown, who was defending Miss Jessica Walker in her upcoming lawsuit. I was surprised that she went back to her maiden name. Of course, Mom and Dad wouldn't like Walker's good name being dragged through the mud. Mr. Brown, making himself comfortable in my house, said, "We'd like you to give a good characterization of Jessica. I mean, Miss Walker," he offered candidly. I laughed. "Why would I do that?" I replied. "Well, before your divorce, you knew Miss Walker better than anyone else. You know she's law-abiding and would never get involved in any criminal endeavors, right?" I don't know if he was asking me that or asserting it, but even I could see where he was going with this. What if he said no? Suddenly there was a voice behind me. Rachel appeared at the bottom of the stairs, obviously eavesdropping on our conversation. Mr. Brown looked at me. "Answer what my wife asked," I suggested. "Well, we can serve a subpoena and make you appear. If you still don't show up, we can charge you and throw you in jail," he said in a threatening tone. My first reaction was to punch him in the face and throw him headfirst out the door. But as I looked at my wife, I realized I had a lot to lose. I had no idea if what he said was right or even legal, but because of one court appearance, I agreed to his demands. It was just easier that way. So here I sit in the waiting room of the courthouse. The trial had been going on for a couple days now, and as I approached my statement, I turned to Rachel. "What do you want me to say, honey?" I asked in a whisper. She took my hand, looked at me with her beautiful brown eyes, and said, "Rachel, you are the most honest and loving person I have ever known. Just be honest." I knew that what I would say in court would likely be irrelevant. My ex-wife's lawyers convinced me to attend the hearing. They wrongly assumed that I would speak well of her. That was probably the biggest mistake they ever made, because I had no intention of doing any such thing. A few days ago, the trial of Kyle Reed concluded. He was found guilty of Class E bigamy, a federal charge of Schedule I drug possession with intent to distribute, perjury, handling stolen property, and a host of charges related to defrauding the U.S. government. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison. Even I was shocked by this sentence. However, in an attempt to get his sentence commuted, he charged Jessica with fraud and dealing in stolen goods. He claimed she was involved because they started a holding company as soon as they were married. What does it say about thieves having no honor? The theft charges were contested, but the IRS arrested her for fraud. "Mr. Green, we're ready to hear from you," the bailiff announced. I rose to my feet and exhaled loudly. Rachel retired to the public gallery, and Jasmine watched over the twins in the waiting room. They were sound asleep, not noticing anything. In the courtroom, my name was announced, and as I approached the podium, I felt the stares of the entire room on me. It was a strange atmosphere. When I took my seat, several people awed, especially those sitting behind the defendant. As I was being sworn in, I turned to face the audience, and for the first time in over a year, I saw Jessica in person. She was dressed in an orange prison uniform and surrounded on either side by a defense team assembled from wealthy people. She was looking at her feet, but I met my gaze with her parents, and then a few of her friends who were sitting behind her. I noticed a couple people who looked at me and with just one lip said, "Wow." The irony of now looking down on them from the witness stand did not escape me. Throughout our marriage, they all looked down on me. Now we had reversed roles. Andrew Brown rose to his feet and began to speak. "Thank you for coming today, Mr. Green," he said. "Well, I didn't have much choice, did I, Mr. Brown?" I replied, looking down at him. He flinched at my tone, and all eyes turned to him to see what his answer would be. At that moment, Jessica finally raised her head and looked in my direction. Her eyes went wide and her jaw dropped open. She suddenly burst into tears, causing everyone to turn around and look at her. The realization must have hit her that the man she had fallen in love with was back, and the man she had created was gone. She was now inconsolable when the judge asked her attorney if he needed a moment to speak to her. He ignored his offer and continued. "Mr. Green, as the defendant's ex-husband, whom my client admittedly treated very well in the divorce, do you agree that the charges against her surprised even you?" he asked, without waiting for an objection from the prosecutor. I was very shocked. "But as far as her treating me well in the divorce, I think you and I have different views on that," I replied confidently, as a whisper was heard from behind his back. "I'm pretty sure I saw Jessica's parents talking to someone on the team, while Jessica continued to sob. "Okay, Mr. Green, but can you say that in all the time you and the defendant have been together, she has always been an honest, hard-working, and law-abiding citizen?" he asked. "Well, she cheated on me for 4 months with a man she described as younger, more attractive, and successful, so we probably have our own ideas of honesty again," I replied. I was beginning to think that at this point her lawyers realized they may have made a mistake. Remember, all he did was threaten to drag me to trial, and I didn't have to paint the image of the perfect, innocent woman. I was just being honest, like Rachel advised. "But agree that you were neglecting yourself physically and intellectually at the time, so when someone better came along, could you really blame the accused for going further?" he said laconically. There was an almost unanimous chorus of disapproving groans from the bench and the prosecution, who obviously felt they were not really needed at the moment. The defense was digging my ex-wife's grave. The judge called order, giving me a chance to mull over my answer. "I agree that I have neglected certain aspects of my life. It was very hard to live with a woman who controlled my life and whose family and friends considered you beneath them. The defendant's father once called me a pretty dumbass," I said openly, and the look of shock and confusion on the defense's faces was so funny it's beyond words. At this point, Jessica just looked at me with pity in her eyes. I had nothing for her in return. "It could very well be Mr. Green, but there is nothing to indicate that the accused was ever involved in criminal activity. There is no evidence that during the years you were together she was dishonest or intended to commit fraud. She paid her bills, even yours, for a while, and never broke the law. Is that right?" he said, visibly agitated. "Objection." The prosecutor rose to her feet. "This is inadmissible, Your Honor. The witness is not here to prove that the defendant didn't commit a crime. This is a waste of the court's time. The judge said that the defense may rephrase the question." Mr. Brown looked puzzled, but coughed and continued his questioning. "Mr. Green, during the years you were together, the defendant was an honest person who paid all her bills, taxes, and mortgage. For a while, she even paid your bills, correct?" he stated. "Yes," I said, "but I have no idea what kind of person she's been for the last year." "Well, I guess we can assume," I said. "Objection," said Mr. Brown, looking at the judge. "What do you mean by objection, Mr. Brown?" "He's your witness," said the judge, trying not to laugh as half the courtroom erupted in laughter. The jury had to turn away. "Your Honor, it's obvious he's an abusive ex-husband who wants revenge on the woman who left him and moved on," he said, starting to get angry. The defense team was beyond worried. Jessica shifted her gaze from her parents to her attorney, tears streaming down her face. The judge spoke again. If he is the ex-husband, why did you call him as a witness? The prosecution just sat there, smiling at each other. Is it true that you are really a hardened man who just wants to see his ex-wife suffer? Mr. Brown asked after some silence. If this had happened 11 months ago, you might be right. But now I have nothing to regret. I may not be a very intelligent man, Your Honor, but I am an honest man. You're welcome, Mr. Green. Your wife. Ex-wife, Mr. Brown, I inserted. Okay. Your ex-wife leaves you for another man and you feel no bitterness or ill will toward her and her family? He questioned. No, as I said 11 months ago, perhaps you might have assumed that. But since then, I've found the most beautiful woman in the world, I said, looking around the public gallery and looking directly at Rachel. People followed my gaze until all eyes stopped on her. She picked me up, brought me back to life, and now I can call her my wife. She gave me 3 beautiful children. We have great friends, a wonderful family, a beautiful home, and a successful business. Who in the world would be sad about all that? I stated, never breaking eye contact with my beautiful wife. The smile never left my lips. She just looked back at me with a beaming smile and nodded her head. I turned around and saw that the defense looked tense, and Jessica's parents were looking at their hands. Jessica looked upset and sobbed when she caught my gaze. I said, "Thank you," with one lip, and she collapsed onto the table with her arms wrapped around herself. I was released and went back to my family. When I walked through the door, I heard a big commotion. Jessica was the center of it. She was yelling, "I'm sorry! I love you!" But whether that was addressed to me or not, I don't know, and frankly, I didn't care. Jessica was found guilty of conspiracy to commit a felony to defraud the U.S. government. I guess the court felt that Kyle Reed wasn't smart enough to do it alone. I read that these are sections 18, 371-26, 7,201, and 7,206, 1 and 2. I had no idea what that meant. She was also found guilty of 5th-degree possession of stolen goods, which was apparently a Class A misdemeanor. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison. This also meant that upon release, she had no chance of pursuing a career in finance. For us, life is beautiful. The twins are getting bigger every day, and their smiles can dispel the clouds on even the gloomiest day, which I'm happy to report is not often. My business is thriving, and even Rachel now has a few clients who come to our home for hair and makeup treatments. Jasmine is finishing up her last year of college, which, by the way, I am now paying for. Well, it's the least I could do for her. I mean, she saved my life. You remember that?